Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Most in Maryland would not know her name, but Elisabeth Gilman, who ran for office on a socialist ticket, left behind a life of activism. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. She was born in New Haven, Connecticut on Christmas Day, 1867. Her father became the first president of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where she led a life that saw her push the progressive issues of the day. She earned her degree at the university and became involved in social work. But her activism and experiences led to her to become a socialist candidate for governor in Maryland. Ross Jones has written a new biography entitled Elisabeth Gilman, Crusader for Justice, capturing an unexpected activist life. And welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Don.
So, well, first of all, what got you interested in her life? And as we were talking, I guess, earlier, this is not a person who people seem to remember.
No, they don't. And for me, it was a happy accident. I was doing research in the archives at Johns Hopkins, and I came across Elisabeth Gilman's name. I'd never heard of her. I didn't know that Daniel Gilman had any children. He had Elisabeth and her older sister, Alice. And so I asked to see the files, and they rolled out a lot of boxes of files. She had given all of her papers to Hopkins in the 1940s. And I started going through them. I spent about an hour or two going through them. Lots of letters, diaries, scrapbooks, pictures. And I said, this is a heck of a story, and I'd like to be able to tell it. And so I started doing more research and writing, and we have a book.
How difficult was it to either find material or maybe perhaps more significantly sort through it all?
The sorting took a little doing. It wasn't hard to find it, although there's one of the characters in the book named Mercer Green Johnston, and I, just by luck, found his material. I decided to Google him, found out that there was a huge collection of his papers in Washington at the Library of Congress. And I went over there, spent about a week looking at his papers, and be able to put the two of them together. They had corresponded a lot, and he kept his correspondence with her, and she had none of his with her. So I was able to solve a little bit of a mystery.
So tell us a little bit about her early years, growing up, and how does that relate, do you think, to what became her activism later on in life?
Well, she was her father, I should say her father, Daniel Gilman, was a social activist himself, and he introduced her to social work when she was a teenager. He founded an organization in Baltimore that promoted social work and asked her to take a look at it and see if she would enjoy working at it, and she did. And she went into homes in southwest Baltimore as a social worker, and they were called friendly visitors in those days. And later, on trips to Europe, he took her to East London, the docks of East London, which were very, very poor. Introduced her to people there who were working with the poor families of East London. And so it began to take a hold of her. And she worked as a social worker up until about World War I, when she went to France in World War I as a volunteer with the YMCA.
So describe the social movements of the time that seemed to catch her eye. We had the social gospel and that kind of thing.
The social gospel movement was very important to her. She said that her calling for socialism was really based on religion. That is bringing the charitable aspects of the Christian religion to the community through socialism. And that was one of the moving forces for her in her life. She met this other gentleman, Mercer Johnston, who was an Episcopal priest, and that was his calling also. And so the two of them kind of reinforced each other's interest in socialism.
So how did that play out in her early years in terms of what she did?
Well, she was a doer in every social issue that came down the street in Baltimore. She really was the centerpiece for liberalism, social reform, social justice in Baltimore for the first 50 years of the last century. And you name the issue, she was there and and working on it. She was involved in raising money for destitute families of striking coal miner workers in West Virginia. She was out with interested in things like lynchings in Maryland. Went to Congress to testify against lynchings, try to get laws passed, anti-lynching laws. Every issue, Spanish Civil War. She was on the anti-Franco side and lining up people to send money and goods over to Spain.
So it's did her experience or her education then lead her then also into this? I mean, is there a combination of her own experience, education, and perhaps her religious beliefs that kind of combine?
I think so. The experience really came out of her church work as a youngster at Old St. Paul's Church in Baltimore. They had a program called the Guild House program in Southwest Baltimore, and she worked out of there as a teenager. And so she built on that, and then worked in the city and as an adult as a social worker, and then she went off to World War I, and when she came back it was a volunteer with the YMCA, and as she came back, she just jumped into all the issues of the day, and this was 1919, and leading up to the Great Depression, she was involved in all kinds of every aspect of social activity you can imagine.
So, what impact did the First World War then have on her?
The First World War interrupted her social activism, but when she came back, I think she was fired up more than ever to get back to work in that field. And she did, and leading up until 1930, when the socialists realized that they had a live wire, and encouraged her, and she accepted to run for governor in 1930.
Now there was when she went off for the First World War, she was not a pacifist, unlike many activists. Is there a dichotomy?
It's really interesting. The Socialist Party was sort of divided in World War I. Those who were pacifists and those who went off to war, and she went off to war. But when she came back, she was became a pacifist, very ardent pacifist, and said that she never wanted to do anything that would encourage war again. Wrote about it.
So how does she then become involved with the Socialist Party? Because I know she supports La Follette and so on.
Yes, and then I'll go back a little bit back to the religious aspect of it.
Yeah.
In 1916, she went to Boston to a religious conference sponsored by the Episcopal Church. She was an activist Episcopalian, and she met a woman there named Vida Scudder, and Vida Scudder was a professor at Wellesley, an Episcopalian activist, but also a socialist. And Elisabeth said that she was fascinated by this woman and learned something from the socialist point of view. She comes back to Baltimore, and a week later, all of the famous socialists of the United States and some from abroad come to have a convention at a place called Sherwood Forest. Maybe you're aware of it, down below Baltimore. And she was invited to attend. And she had more of an introduction to socialism. And she meets this fellow, Mercer Johnston, the Episcopal priest there, and was kind of swept off her feet by he was a charismatic, handsome guy, and was singing the same song, if you will, as she was, about the need for churches not to simply preach about doing good in the world, but actually get out and do it, and get beyond the church door. And that was something that motivated him and motivated her. He was discharged from his church in Trinity Church, Newark, New Jersey, because he was so liberal. He really was more favorable to the socialists than he was to his own church, and the church father said, we can't take a guy like this. He was saying, get out into the community, bring the community into the church. They were very conservative. They didn't want to do it, and so they fired him. And he then was invited to come down and meet with the socialists at Sherwood Forest, and I think he was probably delighted to do it. Elisabeth meets him there and then decides, since he doesn't have any money and his wife, he was married, they didn't have any money, that she would be helpful to him. And she had a lot of money. It came down through her father's family. The Gilmans were wealthy people from Connecticut. And so she supported him for a number of years, wanting to get out, him to get out and write and speak and promote the social gospel as she and he saw it.
So how did she become involved politically with the socialist movement as we?
Well, they
head
saw. I
towards
think the
1930s?
socialists saw her as someone who had been working on behalf of striking workers, helping get food to people who were in need. Had been working in Southwest Baltimore with poor families, and they thought, well, this lady is really representing all of the principles that we stand by, and why shouldn't she become our candidate for governor in 1930? And they asked her, and she accepted, nominated up in Hagerstown, and was off and running. Except that she didn't go out on the trail right away. She went to Europe. She went to Europe and she visited all the socialist countries of Europe. And she told a reporter from the Baltimore Sun that she wanted to see what was happening with socialist countries abroad and give Baltimoreans and Marylanders more than just hot air. She wanted to tell them what was really going on.
So did she visit the Soviet Union at all?
She did visit the Soviet Union.
What was her impression?
Her impression was that it was a great experiment. I think she called it a great experiment, but that it was not appropriate to the United States.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of campaigner was she? When she really gets
she was a fascinating campaigner that would never happen today. Here she comes back from Europe and goes to work. That maybe 6 weeks. That was it. The whole thing was a 6 weeks campaign, and all of her campaigns were short. So here we're talking about campaigns of 2 years.
Right.
But she did it in 6 weeks. Ran all over the state.
Mm-hmm. What kind of response did she get? I mean, was it with large crowds, or do you?
Well, it's really interesting. Who knows? The socialist. There was a lot of socialist newspapers in those days.
Right.
And the socialist newspapers said that there were big crowds.
Right.
The local regular media said not so many. but so it's hard to tell.
So what kind of what kind of platform was she operating on? And as I was looking at some of them, they almost seem very quaint now.
They do. Things like fair wages,
right.
and Social Security wasn't known at that time. Things that workman's compensation, taxing land values, things that we take for granted today didn't exist then. I think that Franklin Roosevelt really did end the socialists in a way, because the New Deal took over all those issues and made things happen, and as you know, got things done that satisfied the socialist points of view.
So, but she is defeated, which is no
by a huge margin.
Right, but she did set a record here.
She did. Yeah,
right.
She was 150% more votes than the time that someone ran for governor on the socialist ticket before.
Right.
Yeah.
So once she gets done with that, where does she go in terms of the Great Depression? Because it's hitting a lot of folks very hard. We don't see the trough until 1933, but
yeah, but she was going to Washington and testifying before congressional committees, urging. There were something like 17 million people out of work at that time, and she was going over there and urging that they put up funds to help people who were out of work. So and what was her sense about whether or not the church was doing enough during this period? She was not happy that she said they weren't doing enough, not nearly enough. And there's a letter in my book that she had written to the bishop of the Episcopal Church of Maryland. She said she'd gone away to go to France in 1917, and when she came back, nothing much had changed. They weren't doing nearly enough, and she was pushing him to be more of an activist in social issues. So, during this period, we obviously have the rise of fascism in
Yes.
Europe.
She was clearly an anti-fascist. How did that affect her? And yet she was a pacifist, I think, at heart. I think,
well, she was a pacifist, but the story I tell in the book about the ambassador from Italy named Dino Grandi coming to Washington, D.C., to visit the State Department. And there was a big protest against a big parade protesting his presence in the country. This is in the 30s. And she wasn't as out front on this subject. And I wondered why. And it turned out that he came to Baltimore after he visited in Washington. And he was a friend of the Garrett family, John Wirt Garrett, who lived in Baltimore, was involved with the B&O Railroad, the family was early on, and had an estate on Charles Street known as Evergreen. And the Grandies were coming to visit the Garretts at Evergreen, probably because they knew each other and met in Rome when Garrett was ambassador from the United States to Italy. But Elisabeth kept a low profile on that one, and I think maybe because a little too close to home.
So she also then runs, of course, for mayor.
She ran for mayor. She ran for governor again.
Right.
She ran for the United States Senate twice. She ran for mayor. She even ran for sheriff of Baltimore City.
Why was she running?
She was always using that platform, always using the platform to get across her social justice, social reform issues, and the principles of the Socialist Party.
And even in her mayoral run, I mean, she still seems to, city-owned dairies and coal.
Absolutely, absolutely. She didn't vary from that very much at all. But she didn't have much of it. The numbers were very small, but she still used that platform to try to make her points.
And also, I guess the Nazis were invited to display their flag at the parade.
Yes.
What was that about?
Well, there was the it was the 300th anniversary, I think, of the city of Baltimore, or was it founding in Maryland? I forget. But there was a big parade, and they had a group carrying the traditional German state flag, and then there was a group wanted to carry the Nazi flag, and she protested heavily to have that removed, and I think she failed. It was carried anyhow.
Right.
Yeah.
Was she concerned that fascism or Nazism
was
getting a presence, a foothold in the United States?
She was very concerned about that. On the other hand, she was always a great defender of civil liberties. However, the ACLU branch of Maryland, the Maryland ACLU branch, was founded in her living room on Park Avenue in 1931, and she was always a proponent of civil liberties.
And yet she was, I guess she attended the Democratic Convention in '36.
I think she did. Yeah.
I mean, so she's kind of like moving around.
She is. She was a whirling dervish. She was everywhere, and she really was the center of liberalism and of social justice, social reform in Baltimore for all that time.
So, the kinds of things that she wanted to do, they seem, I guess they were progressive at the time, whether it's civil rights or racial equality, and how, by the way, did she see the issue of race in Baltimore?
She didn't write about it a lot, but she was writing to newspapers in the 1890s, protesting schools for African American kids that were in very, very bad condition, and saying that they ought to do something about them. She had an experience where she wanted to honor the editor of The Nation magazine, Oswald Villard, in 1928. She invited him to Baltimore, and he wanted to give a big party. She decided she wanted to do it at the Southern Hotel, which was the #1 hotel in those days, known as the Pearl of Light Street, by the way. And she went to the hotel. They were all set with a date, and then they discovered that she was having African Americans as part of the guest list. They said, well, we can't serve Negroes. That's against our policy. And so she went to every hotel in Baltimore, and they got the same answer. And so she said, heck with this, I'm going to do this at my home. And so she had 100 people at her home, including the African American group, and celebrated Villard's 10 years of service as the editor of the magazine.
What was her sense about equality? I mean, she spent a lot of time, protesting, for instance, the schools issue with resources and that kind of thing. Yeah. How far ahead of where we were was she?
I don't know. I can't.
I mean, do you have any sense at all?
I don't have a real. I really don't have a sense. She's a person of her time.
Yeah.
You know, she went not led, but she went with a delegation to Washington with Baltimore civil rights leaders protesting lynching in the 30s. And you know, it fascinated me in realizing that there were several bills that went before the Congress. They never got anywhere, and nothing really happened until the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right.
Where the federal government took a stand against lynching, which is astonishing. She went in 1935 with this group, and the last lynching was in Maryland in 1933. So it was very much a part of her, in her mind and theirs too.
So how did her relationship with Mercer develop? And there seems to be a split, a divide.
Well, it developed.
How did that work?
As I mentioned, because they didn't, the Johnsons didn't have any money. She did, and she wanted to help them, and they worked together for several years. But then, as the Depression came on, money became tight, not for her necessarily, but for other funding resources. And there was one moment where he made an application for a grant from a foundation, and didn't get it. And she had a lot of influence with that foundation, and he thought that she had let him down. And he wrote a very, very hot letter to her. She kept her calm and said she was sorry, but that wasn't really the way it had worked out. Nonetheless, he began to fade away. She had bought, he and his wife, a house in Baltimore, if you can believe it. And they decided that he would go to Washington and work in Washington. And so he moved to Washington, and they saw each other a little bit over time after that, but not much. And by the time she ran for governor in 1930, they were not in touch with each other.
Did he ever make a living?
He did. He worked for the federal government.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, he did. And before that, he was kind of a lobbyist for social justice and social reform causes. But she kind of kept him afloat for a number of years.
Right. So her homes, they don't exist anymore.
No, unfortunately, they were torn down. Her house was torn down for a parking lot on 513 Park Avenue. Yeah.
What was the house like?
It was what you would call a great old Victorian mansion. I, of course, didn't see it. I saw a picture of it. And I did meet one gentleman whose parents used to visit her on Sunday for Sunday dinner, about once a month, rather. And he was just a kid when he went there, but he told me about this big dining room, long, high windows, high ceilings, dark wood, a dining table loaded with silver and goblets and all this kind of thing. So it was a different era. It was out of the Victorian era.
Almost sort of we're talking about really sort of wealthy people
from that period.
Yeah.
From that period, yeah. And she could have, I believe she could have just coasted on her wealth if she wanted to and traveled all the time. She traveled a lot, but she could have traveled all the time. But she at some point early on in her life, she was gripped by this notion of helping other people through social work.
I think at a testimonial dinner, there was a quote I ran across, I think it was in your book, about I worked with organizations that were not radical in the best sort of way, but they were not getting at the roots of things. Socialists want a better place for everyone to live.
Right.
Is that her legacy?
I think it is. I think it is. Yeah.
So we know about her now. There's at least one book. Why do you think she has disappeared from our consciousness?
I think she disappeared primarily because she didn't do any writing herself. She didn't leave. She didn't. The woman I think I mentioned earlier, this woman Vida Scudder, who was at Wellesley College and was a socialist and a religious reformer, did a lot of writing, a lot of speaking around. Elisabeth was much more of a doer, and she did her thing and then she moved on. And I think the problem is she didn't leave a lot of material that in the public eye that people can refer to. So I hope that I've helped get a little bit out about her, so that people will have an understanding and an appreciation. In her day, she was a big deal in Baltimore.
You talk about how that she was front page news, the
She
quotes,
was.
and
They cover the press covered her, all the papers covered her, all trips abroad, when she came home, what she did. It was an amazing. She was a character. She was a character. But the Baltimore Sun, in its final tribute to her, in an editorial, said that she was just a character of the highest order, and someone that they mourned the loss. The city mourned the loss of Elisabeth when she died in 1950.
I mean, it doesn't seem as if she, in her relationships, that she was necessarily approached them in any kind, in an angry sort of way. I mean, there was the obit quote, I think it was from the Sun, but said that she had the ability to prod people,
Exactly.
usually agreeably to think.
Exactly. Yeah. No, she wasn't. She wasn't. She was restrained. It's so different from today. No yelling and screaming that I can have seen in her papers, but restrained and but driven. She was driven. There's no doubt about it. To accomplish what she wanted for her religious beliefs and her social beliefs.
So when we look back on her, is there something that you think you came to appreciate about her? I mean, obviously, there's not somebody who was in the forefront when you started out on your journey here, but what kind of impression did she leave with you?
She left an impression of a devoted social worker. I call her a social worker on steroids. I mean, someone who really cared about people, men, women, children of the working community, of the working classes, and she did her best to help them in any way she could.
What do you think she would have thought of where we are today?
I think she would have been distressed. I think she'd been distressed, and she'd been going down to Washington, just like she did back then, pounding her fist and making sure people listened.
But in an aristocratic, restrained way.
Yeah, in a reasonable way.
Well, we've been speaking with Ross Jones. He's written a new biography entitled Elisabeth Gilman, Crusader for Justice, really capturing, I think, an unexpected activist life. She, of course, was the daughter of the first president of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, earned a degree at the university, became obviously involved with social work, but she was an activist both politically and socially.
Yes, she was.
Well, I appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you very much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.